15 Days Practice for IELTS Listening. Brought to you by Knowledge Island by Bilal.
Day 12. True or false, 1.
Listen to the extract of a television travel program and then decide whether each of the statements below is true or false. First, you have some time to read the questions. Now, listen to the extract. Hello and welcome to another edition of Your Holiday. And in tonight's programme, we'll have reports on Sardinia, Austria, the Black Sea coast of Turkey, and the little-known kingdom of Bhutan, way up in the Himalayas. But first, we go over to our news desk and Paul Wells. Paul?
Thanks, Mary. And first of all, some up-to-date news for potential visitors to Guatemala, as there has been some confusion about who needs a visa and who needs a tourist card. Well, if you're travelling on a British or Irish passport, you'll have to shell out $10 for a visa, which is valid for a stay of up to 30 days, and must be obtained before travelling to Guatemala. Apparently, visa extensions are very difficult to obtain. Most other EEC nationals can obtain a tourist card on arrival at the border for just $1, valid for 30 days, extendable to 90, but this extension will cost you a further $5. At the moment, it's unclear if this applies to French nationals who may need a visa. Check at your local consulate before leaving for Guatemala. Switching to Asia now, Burma has announced that the tourist visa facility will not be available for the time being. Regular viewers of this programme will no doubt remember that visas were also restricted to 7 days in any case, but apparently you won't even get your week in now. The reason given is the recent state of unrest within the country, particularly in and around the capital, Rangoon, where visitors' safety cannot be guaranteed at present. Now, we have had reports from our correspondent in Thailand that the Burmese embassy in Bangkok is continuing to issue 7-day visas, despite the official announcement. But it would seem a risky business going there at the moment, even if you can get in. And finally from me, news of a welcome price reduction for children under the age of 5 at most resorts on the Costa del Sol in the south of Spain. There'll be at least 25% off all year round, and as much as 70% off in the low season, depending on the resorts. And on that happy note, it's back to you, Mary.
True or false, 2.
You will hear part of a lecture on satellites. Look at questions 1 to 7 and decide whether the statements are true or false. First, you have some time to read the questions. Now, listen to the lecture.
The first man-made satellite was put into space by the Russians on October 4th, 1957, called Sputnik 1. It caused enormous interest around the world. Although American scientists had already made plans to put their own satellite into space at the same time, their first attempt failed. The first satellite, Explorer 1, was eventually put up on February 1st, 1958. The space race had started. Since those early days, the pace has quickened. Now we use satellites for a variety of purposes to improve the quality of our lives. For instance, satellites are used to help forecast the weather more accurately. Storms can be watched, advance warnings of droughts and floods can be given, and pollution can be detected by satellites. Another way satellites can help is by allowing scientists to study the mineral and natural face of the planet. Deposits of minerals, oil and natural gas can be found this way. The rate of destruction of forests and the use of land for agriculture can also be charted. Something which benefits us all is the communications revolution, and this would not have been possible without satellites. There are now sophisticated telecommunications systems which enable you to phone direct all over the world. Colour photographs can be sent immediately from one end of the world to the other. Television programmes, such as the famous Live Aid pop concert, can be seen simultaneously round the world. This concert was seen by a worldwide audience of 1.5 billion people. There's another use for satellites about which we naturally know much less: their use in military operations. Satellites are regularly used by countries who wish to spy on each other. In fact, this is considered one of the most important uses of satellites. Perhaps the best-known way of putting satellites into space is through the American Shuttle service, which was first launched in 1981. This is manned, that is, men are put up into space with the rocket to launch the satellites. However, this is not considered necessary by some experts, and manned spaceflight suffered a serious setback when all 7 astronauts were killed in the Challenger disaster of January 1986. Shortly after liftoff, the rocket exploded and totally destroyed the mission. After this disaster, an alternative system, which did not put human life at risk, seemed preferable. In direct competition is the European rocket launch system, the Ariane L3S. This system is unmanned. The first launch from the Ariane's base in French Guiana on the northeast coast of South America took place in 1979. The Ariane system is built by 10 European countries together, who form the European Space Agency, the ESA. Both these systems, the American Shuttle and the European Ariane, are in active competition for the multi-billion-dollar business of putting satellites into space.
True or false, 3.
You will hear a college lecturer being interviewed about the subject of her new book. Look at questions 1 to 7 and decide if the statements are true or false. First, you have some time to read the questions. Now, listen to the interview.
Now we turn to Pat Maynard, Senior Lecturer in Education at King's College London, to talk about her new book on co-educational schools, A Mixed Blessing, which is published today. Pat, your findings make fascinating reading. They seem to suggest that girls do not benefit from being educated in mixed-sex co-educational schools.
Well, I think they do more than suggest that. It is very clear from my research that girls are at a disadvantage in mixed-sex schools.
Can you give us some examples?
Certainly. We found, for example, that the behaviour of boys in the classroom towards girls actively discourages girls from speaking. When a girl tries to speak, typically boys fold their arms, lean back in their chairs, and groan or pull faces. They look bored and even make comments like, "Turn it off," or "Pull its plug out." Now, if you were treated to insulting behaviour like that, what do you think your reaction would be? It would take considerable courage to continue, and in fact, we found that most girls learn that keeping quiet rather than contributing to the lesson in any active way was the most sensible thing to do.
Indeed. So you found that boys do most of the talking in the classroom?
Yes, and not only do boys dominate the classroom verbally, but they do so physically as well. One girl, for example, told me that boys deliberately take up a lot of room. If a girl wants to get up and get something, she has to climb over boys' legs, blocking the aisles. Then we notice that boys will deliberately lean across a girl's desk to each other, putting their arms all over her work in the process. And then, even worse, if the girl protests, he will act with astonishment as if he hadn't noticed that there was a girl sitting there.
That seems extraordinary, Pat. But what evidence do you have?
For example, we've got diagrams of classroom seating to show that boys dominate the teacher's line of vision and push girls to the edge of that vision. Another thing, we have many recordings of teachers telling girls to be quick when they're speaking, because if they're not, then the boys will start to make a noise and disturb the class. It's easier for the teacher if she or he pays more attention to the boys, because it's the boys and not the girls who cause the trouble. Girls don't make a noise when boys are talking.
But what about the argument that single-sex schools do not prepare girls, and boys too, for that matter, for life?
What goes on in mixed-sex schools is exactly what goes on in the outside world. Men, or in this case boys, dominate women, in this case girls. This is what people call normal behavior. It is precisely for this reason that I would argue that girls should go to single-sex schools where they will not be dominated by boys and where they will have a chance to develop their potential without interference. Let's take our most famous example, Margaret Thatcher. Where would she be now if she had gone to a mixed school? But she was fortunate. She went to a school where she had a chance to speak, to learn how to express herself, to be listened to with respect and attention. So she was able to develop the confidence to go out into the world, a man's world, and to resist attacks from men. My research shows that this is what girls need.
Well, on that very interesting point, we must say thank you, Pat Maynard. Her book, A Mixed Blessing, is published today. Price £3.95.
True or false, 4.
You are going to listen to an article from a magazine. Look at questions 1 to 9 and decide if the statements are true or false. First, you have some time to read the questions. Now, listen to the talk.
Man has always been curious, and since prehistoric times he has looked for new lands to conquer. First he explored his cave, then the land, next the sea, and eventually the air. Now, finally, man is exploring space, and dreams of leaving the Earth have come true. This wish to leave the Earth and reach other planets was first mentioned in the 2nd century AD, when a Greek, Lucian of Samos, wrote 2 fantasies about men who went to the moon. One used a pair of wings made by himself, while the other was carried there by a waterspout during a storm. The moon was the obvious destination in early literature, as it is the nearest planet to the Earth and has clearly visible markings which led to imaginative conjecture about life there. But after Lucian, for the next 1,400 years, no other writings about travelling to the moon have survived. Man seemed content in his belief that the Earth was the most important planet in the centre of the universe, and therefore there was no necessity to leave it. This view was reinforced by the Christian Church, and in 1543 Copernicus was condemned as heretical when he published his revolutionary theory that the sun was the centre of the universe, and the Earth, the moon, and other planets revolved about it. Although this theory was criticised, it started men thinking about the stars again. Not long afterwards, the first telescope was invented in Holland, and Galileo, the brilliant Italian astronomer, used one to explore the heavens and discover much new information about the planets. When his observations were published in 1610, the Church threatened to excommunicate him, so he retracted most of his statements. But man's imagination had been stirred by this new knowledge, and in 1634, Kepler, the German astronomer who had discovered how the planets moved round the sun, published a story about a journey to the moon. His hero was transported there by magic moon people who could fly through space. Included in the story was a detailed description of the moon's surface, which Kepler had seen through his telescope. After Kepler's book, there were many more stories about space travel and voyages to the moon. Mostly they were fantasies, but some contained attempts at discussion of space travel, describing physical conditions on the moon, and proposing ways in which man could possibly live there. Rockets were first suggested as spaceships by Cyrano de Bergerac in two space adventures written in 1649 and 1652. He was also the first writer to send his space travellers to the sun as well as to the moon. But when these books were written over 300 years ago, no one seriously thought that it would be possible to travel in space. It was not until Jules Verne, the French novelist, wrote his famous story, From the Earth to the Moon, in 1865, that any attempt was made to apply known scientific principles to spacecraft. Man had been experimenting with flying ever since 1783, the advent of the first hot air balloon. But although various gliders and airships were invented, it wasn't until 1903 that the first powered flight was made by the Wright brothers in a wooden biplane. By this time, H.G. Wells had already published his famous space stories, The Time Machine and The First Men on the Moon. So, once again, writers were leading the way. Wells's prophecy in the latter story wasn't to come true until 1969, when the two Americans, Armstrong and Aldrin, finally stepped out onto the moon's surface. Since then, rockets have landed on Venus and Mars, and with the launching of the space shuttle, it will not be long before men visit other planets. Then it will be interesting to see if Wells's other prophecy will come true and man will travel faster than light. Will he, in fact, build his own time machine and travel through time as well as space? Many modern science fiction writers have gone far beyond this speculation and have their heroes teleporting from spaceship to planet with the greatest ease, dematerializing and materializing again at will, and making loops with time to unite past and future without effort. How much of this will come true we can only guess. But one thing we can be sure of is that writers will continue to stimulate our imagination with marvellous adventures, spectacular prophecies, and astounding ideas, some of which, no doubt, come true and change fiction to fact.
True or false, 5.
Listen to the following conversation between two students. Look at questions 1 to 7 and decide if the statements are true or false. First, you have some time to read the questions. Now, listen to the conversation. Here's your coffee, John.
Thanks, Pauline. Now, shall we start thinking about this talk, then? Let's see, it's on the 20th, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. That gives us 3 weeks to plan it. Shall we start by thinking about what exactly we want to include?
Yes, that's a good idea. Now, here's some paper to make some notes.
Right. Now, the talk is about pollution in the inner city. We should include some information to show how polluted they are, shouldn't we?
Yes, it would be interesting to have some figures to show, for example, how much car exhaust fumes pollute the air. We could possibly get them from the Department of the Environment, couldn't we?
Yes. Then at least people would be aware just how serious this problem is. And then we could go on to point out where all this carbon monoxide comes from.
You mean, for instance, cars and lorries?
Do we have any statistics about how much the number of cars in the inner city has grown?
Yes, that's no problem. I think car owners should see just how much it has increased. People like to use their own cars all the time, don't they?
Yes, it's quite incredible, really, especially as the bus service here where we live is not bad. I mean, in other cities the public transport system is terrible, but at least the city council has given grants to improve it here.
But I still wish people would use it more. Should we mention ways of cutting down on the number of private cars by introducing, for example, a park and ride scheme so shoppers can leave their cars outside the city centre and travel in by bus?
Yes, we could save that until the end of the talk as a possible solution. And how about the problem of the lack of parks and green areas? There aren't many here, are there?
No, that's a definite point to mention.
OK, let's see. Cars, parks. How about cycle lanes? They've been very successful in other places in reducing the number of cars in the inner city.
That may be asking for too much. We've been asked to write a leaflet about the subject too, so maybe we could include it in that instead.
Yes, I suppose we can't ask for everything at once. But I really think we ought to say something about the lorries which are allowed to drive through the city centre.
You mean to suggest an idea to reduce their numbers?
That's not enough. We need the council to introduce a law to ban them altogether. I know the shopkeepers won't like it, but...
Yes, it'll be difficult, but it's necessary to make people aware of how much they pollute the air. So let's make a note of that too, banning lorries in the city centre.
Yes, and shoppers will feel safer with no lorries there. It's definitely time we had more pedestrian precincts too. Should we include that?
I'm not sure. I'd rather keep this talk simple. The council won't like it if we make too many demands, will they?
No, they won't. OK, well then, let's see. So far we've got these ideas. Look at the number of...
Don't forget to comment, like, and share our video.